This module will serve as an introduction to the three-term contingency. The agenda for this module will be composed of a brief explanation of applied behavior analysis, with the majority of the presentation being focused on the three-term contingency and practicing key concepts. There will be quiz questions embedded throughout the presentation. In this module, we will be going over the basis of our understanding of behavior: what causes it, what it is, what keeps that behavior occurring. Applied behavior analysis, or ABA for short, is the science of studying environmental causes of behavior and then applying the principles of learning to improve socially significant behaviors. ABA has been used to teach foundational skills to individuals with developmental and intellectual disabilities and decrease problem behavior in a variety of contexts. It has also been used to increase productivity, job satisfaction, and mitigate accidents in the workplace. The principles of behavior have been applied to many socially significant phenomena. However, most of them are beyond the scope of this module series. This module series will focus on acquisition of skills and treatment of problem behavior. We will start at a place where everyone has had some experience. That's behavior. At first, behavior seems like it's a simple thing because every single one of us engages in behavior. But what exactly is behavior? Simply put, behavior is anything an organism does in its environment. Behavior can include both appropriate, socially acceptable actions such as cheering at a sporting event, and other socially inappropriate actions like yelling at a classmate in school. Furthermore, this definition can refer to events that are easily observable to other people and events that are not observable, such as thinking. Even with this definition, things can get a little uncertain, and it is often easier to define what a behavior is not than what it is. To test whether something is or is not a behavior, we can use the dead man's test. To use the dead man's test, simply think of something that might be a behavior and ask yourself, could a dead person do this? If the answer is yes, then it does not pass the dead man's test and is not a behavior. If the answer is no, then it does pass the dead man's test and it is considered a behavior. Let's go over a few examples. First up is walking. So ask yourself, can a dead person walk? How about talking? Do dead people talk? Can a dead person rip up paper? Can a dead person engage in non-compliance? When you think you have the answers to these questions, proceed to the next slide. Dead people do not walk, they do not talk, and they don't rip up paper. All of those pass the dead man's test and are therefore behaviors. However, dead people are non-compliant. Since dead people are non-compliant, it does not pass the dead man's test and is not behavior. The dead man's test can give us a pretty good understanding of what is and is not behavior. Another key distinction is the difference between labels and behavior. Saying someone has a bad attitude, for example, is a label for a collection of individual behaviors. Those behaviors could include that the individual frowns, avoids eye contact, and complains frequently. We could probably come up with a lot more behaviors that could be classified under the label of having a bad attitude. The same holds for when you say someone has autism or is intelligent. These are labels, not behavior. So, why is this important? We are spending a lot of time on it, but does it matter if we know what is and isn't behavior? Every intervention, assessment, and analysis that we do in ABA revolves around measuring behaviors. Knowing the difference between behaviors and non-behaviors enables us to accurately measure specific behavioral change. So it may seem kind of obvious, but being able to recognize what is and isn't behavior is an important step in behavioral intervention and assessment. Let's practice. Take a moment and study each of the words on the screen. Try to identify which of these are behaviors and which are labels. The only behavior in this group of words is smiling. All others are labels. If you missed any of these, don't worry. We will do some more practice later. Let's take one of the previous examples and expand on it a little bit. Let's say your friend Jim were to come up to you and say he was depressed. From this single sentence, you might be able to infer some of the behaviors he exhibits. Take some time to imagine that now. If Jim said he was depressed, would he smile a lot? How much time would he spend outdoors? Do you think Jim is more or less interested in things he once found enjoyable? What do you think depression actually means? You were probably able to come up with answers to those questions, but as Jim continues talking, he tells you that his depression takes the form of staying at home instead of attending social functions and sleeping for excessively long periods of time. This is exactly the problem with labels. We may erroneously assume or attribute specific behaviors to that label. If a teacher says a student is just bad in school, what do we do? Do we help them learn to read more efficiently? Teach them how to spend more time on task? Teach better study habits at home? Maybe all of the above. Until we get down to specific behaviors, we can't begin to help. This doesn't mean that depression is not a real thing that has an impact on people. We just want to ensure that we're discussing and intervening on possible component behaviors of depression. Let's practice again. What words from this list are labels and are not behaviors? Hopefully this time it was a little easier. The labels here are weird and sad. We can absolutely describe someone as weird or being sad, but both of these labels can be broken down into actual behaviors. So, in summary, an easy way to determine if something is or is not behavior is to use the dead man's test. Outside of this test, if something is a label, we know that it is also not a behavior. Now that we have an understanding of behavior, we are going to try to put this into a larger framework. Behavior does not simply occur spontaneously for no reason. Part of why behavior analysis has been able to accomplish so much is because it attributes behavior to environmental factors rather than intrinsic or internal motivation, meaning an organism's history of interaction with their environment is responsible for the behaviors they exhibit in the future. Part of what this means is that the consequences that follow a behavior are what keeps that behavior going. A consequence is a change in the environment that takes place soon after the behavior occurs and alters the future probability of that behavior. That last part is critically important. Many things may happen shortly after a behavior occurs. It is only considered a consequence if the future probability of the behavior occurring changes as a result. Generally speaking, there are two types of consequences: reinforcement and punishment. Reinforcement occurs when the future probability of that behavior increases or remains the same. Punishment is the opposite, in that the future frequency of that behavior is suppressed. It can be easy to see the word punishment and immediately think a punishing consequence is something bad. By definition, all that matters is that it decreases the future frequency of that behavior occurring. If I give you candy as a consequence for a behavior, and that decreases the future probability of that behavior occurring, then the candy functions as punishment. However, if the same candy increases the future probability of behavior, then it was reinforcement. Punishment and reinforcement have absolutely nothing to do with what the consequence looks like. They are defined purely by the effect they have on behavior. The next examples are similar to previous ones. They will each provide an example. Please read through each example before moving on. The next few slides will give you a chance to practice the difference between reinforcement and punishment. Read each example and then make your decision before going on. Try to check your answers and see if you got the correct one. The importance of understanding consequences is vital to ABA. It is so important that the entirety of the next module will be dedicated to exploring reinforcement and punishment more thoroughly. This is because consequences are the mechanism behind learning. Whether it is desirable behavior or problem behavior, it is the consequences that maintain it. Thus, understanding that which truly is a consequence for behavior means that you understand what is causing behavior and can be more effective in intervening. Finally, most behavioral interventions are focused on the consequences. Next, we will discuss antecedents. Before we get too far along, however, we will need to define and explain a few terms. The first is environment. An environment is a collection of stimuli with which an organism interacts. It is also important to note that internal things are part of the environment. For example, a deprivation of food is not something that is necessarily part of a person's external environment, but this state of deprivation is part of their internal environment. A few examples of an environment would be a classroom full of students with a teacher giving a lecture, the candy aisle of a grocery store, or a car ride on a hot summer day. Each of these environments are comprised of different stimuli that affect the likelihood of any given behavior occurring. So we just used the word stimulus. While we're at it, we should probably define it as well. A stimulus is any perceivable aspect of an organism's environment. It can be helpful to view a stimulus as individual components of the environment. So take the classroom from the previous example. In this classroom environment, there could be many different stimuli. An example of a stimulus could include a change in temperature of the room, the teacher starting a lecture on a different topic, such as math, and even the whispered voice of a classmate. All of these are stimuli inside the larger classroom environment. With all these stimuli occurring in the natural environment, the actual antecedents are those stimuli that occur closest before a specific behavior. Some examples may include instruction, the discontinuation of an activity, presentation of work materials, noises, presence of people, and many others. These antecedents can further be divided into two groups: discriminative stimuli and motivating operations. Discriminative stimuli are events that set the occasion for behavior. These stimuli signal the availability of behavioral consequences. They may include things like instructions, traffic lights, presence of people, and others. Motivating operations are events that temporarily affect the value of consequences. In layman terms, motivating operations change how much the person wants the consequence. One example is going without food or water. If you go for long enough without food or water, food and water become very valuable. Let's take a look at discriminative stimuli. SDs are stimuli that change the probability of behavior because in the past, when that stimulus has been present, the behavior has resulted in a particular consequence. Essentially, the SD signals the availability of a reinforcer for a particular behavior. Now we will look at a few examples. In the first example, the discriminative stimulus is the stoplight turning red. The red light signals that you can avoid getting in an accident by engaging in a behavior that stops your car. That's most likely pressing the brake pedal. In this example, the SD is that mom says, "Come sit down for dinner." This signals that the consequence of eating food is available if you engage in the behavior of sitting at the dinner table. In this example, the SD is that your alarm clock goes off in the morning, the behavior is when you get up, and the consequence is that you are to work on time. In this example, we have a student who sees their principal in the hallway. What behavior would you expect this student to engage in if the consequence is to avoid getting yelled at? As an example, the student may walk more quietly once they see their principal in order to avoid getting yelled at. This time, the behavior is already filled out. What would be a possible discriminative stimulus in this situation? Yeah, maybe realizing that you forgot your notepad or paper. The other type of antecedent is a motivating operation. An MO is a stimulus event or process that temporarily changes the value of a consequence. In short, it alters how much a person desires a consequence and influences what that individual does in order to get a desired consequence. MOs are powerful because they can temporarily make an item more or less desirable, or in other words, it makes certain behaviors more or less likely to occur. For example, playing outside in the hot sun may increase the value of a glass of water. However, if you've already had 2 big glasses of water, water becomes less desirable. A good way to think about MOs is through deprivation and satiation. Deprivation is the lack of something, while satiation is the abundance of something. Deprivation could include being deprived of water after being in the desert for a day. This would make water more valuable as a consequence. Not having eaten ice cream for a few days might make ice cream a more valuable reinforcer. And if you haven't seen your best friend in years, then their personal attention might be very valuable to you. The opposite is true for satiation. The MO of drinking a gallon of milk in an hour would make milk less valuable as a reinforcer. A hot dog eating contest in which you participate is an MO to eat more hot dogs. Finally, if you go on a long road trip with a friend, you may want some space for a while afterward, and maybe their attention isn't as valuable as a consequence. Here are a few more examples of how an MO can potentially change an individual's behavior. Take a moment to read through these examples. Now let's practice. A student has many pencils in their backpack. Would this make the reward of getting a new pencil more or less valuable? That's right, it would probably be less valuable as a consequence because the student is likely satiated on pencils. How about a child that does not have access to a computer at home? Would computer time offered at school, as a consequence, be more or less valuable? That's right, it would probably be more valuable as a consequence because the child is deprived of computer access at home. Now is a great time to check and make sure you know some of the differences and similarities between motivating operations and discriminative stimuli. Take a moment and come up with your own answers. The main similarity is that they are both antecedent events that have effects on consequences. The main difference is that SDs signal the availability of a given consequence, while motivating operations make that consequence more or less valuable. Determining what signals students to engage in appropriate and inappropriate behavior will allow us to manage the antecedents so students are more likely to be successful until they have learned appropriate replacement behaviors. If we can eliminate antecedents for problem behavior, we decrease the likelihood that an individual will exhibit that problem behavior. In summary, we have learned that the environment is comprised of many different stimuli. The most relevant stimuli in relation to behavior are called antecedents. These antecedents will reliably occur before a given behavior. Antecedents can then be broken down into SDs and MOs. SDs signal that a consequence is available, while MOs alter the value of that consequence. So, here we are at last. This is the 3-term contingency. Antecedent events come before the behavior. SDs signal that reinforcement or punishment is available. MOs alter the value of those consequences. The behavior occurs to get access to that consequence. And lastly, the presence of reinforcement or punishment increases or decreases the future occurrence of that behavior. This 3-term contingency is sometimes called the ABCs of behavior analysis. This framework is how behavior analysts view behavior. Every successful intervention has been based on observations made about antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. Next time you see behavior occur in the real world, try to look at it through this lens. It isn't some unknowable force that causes behavior, but rather directly observable stimuli in the environment. We will now practice everything we've gone over in this module. This is your last chance to practice before the final round of questions, so please read each example provided before continuing on. Then, answer the question below the provided example. You will get answers after each example. If you miss one, go back and determine why the given answer differed from your choice.